Hello, we're back today with another exclusive interview and another distinguished guest. We're here today with Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad. He is one of the highest ranking Muslims ever serving the United States. He is also former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, United Nations, and Afghanistan. We're honored to have you here today with us.
Very nice to be with you.
Thank you very much for your time. So, Mr. Khalilzad, the election is coming up and the competition is really tight. What do you expect is going to happen over the next few days?
Well, I, of course, don't know what will happen. As you say correctly, the polls have tightened. It indicates that it will be, if the current trends hold, very close elections. And it's an important election, and there are lots of big and important issues at stake, especially with regard to foreign policy. The world is a very difficult, complicated, and dangerous place right now, more than it was 8 years ago when President Obama took over from President Bush. Also, internally, we were more polarized than we were 8 years ago. And the new president, whether it's Mr. Trump or Mrs. Clinton, will have not only a huge domestic task, but a huge international task, how to come up with a strategy that's appropriate for this more difficult and more dangerous world, and also that one can build a bipartisan support for such a strategy. So the inheritance will be difficult of the new president, the task will be very difficult, the challenges will be very difficult. This is going to be an extraordinary election and post-election period for America.
Right. You're the person who introduced Donald Trump when he spoke about his foreign policy in Washington, D.C. So you're aware of both candidates' foreign policies. Which one of them do you endorse? Which one of them do you think would have a better impact in moving the Middle East specifically towards becoming a more stable and peaceful region?
Well, the Middle East is in a particularly one of the regions that is in a very dangerous set of circumstances right now. The Middle East has been unstable for a long time, but it's now perhaps more difficult and more unstable than many times when you look at the last 30, 40 years. The new president would have to deal with a variety of challenges. The challenge of extremism and terror. ISIS, Daesh will be a problem that the new president will inherit. The fight continues. I applaud and salute the Peshmerga for the sacrifices that they have made in confronting Daesh, and as we speak, they're fighting with Daesh near Mosul. But the problem is not only in Iraq, but also what happens to Syria. Daesh is still there. And then Daesh has spread to many countries, not only in the Middle East, but beyond. They're in Libya, they're in Afghanistan, and they're in many other places as well. And then there is the issue of what happens to defeat Daesh, not only tactically by taking Mosul, for example, away from them, but strategically, so that they will not come back. That gets into the post-Daesh Mosul. What happens there? What kind of political arrangements are made? What kind of security arrangements are made? How does the Iraqi government treat the local population? What role do the Ashtashabi, the popular militias, play? What happens to the role of Turkey? Of course, Kurdistan's own role with regard to the territories. And you can say the same thing about Syria, and then the broader issue of Iraq and Syrian civil wars. What kind of an arrangement can be made to bring that to an end? What roles will the regional powers who are at war almost indirectly with each other, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, what role will they play? So there are lots of issues that the new president will have to come to terms with. With regard to the candidates, I think Hillary Clinton and Trump both would pursue policies that are different than President Obama. In the case of Hillary Clinton, the difference will be small on some issues. I think Trump could question both the objectives that the U.S. has had and the strategy for pursuing those objectives. So it will be a bigger change likely if it is Trump, but there will also be change, there will be some change if it's Mrs. Clinton.
Right. You rightly pointed out that even by Middle Eastern standards, Middle East is at a point of crisis. You also pointed out that it's not easy to come up with a solution because of all these various factors that play a role in the region. Now, you have criticized United States disengagement with certain countries, with Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly after going there. Now, building on everything you have talked about before and here with us today, how do you think the United States or the next president, regardless of who it will be, would be able to make sure that history would not repeat itself?
Well, very important question, and I do think that we made some mistakes. For example, in the invasion of Iraq, we made some mistakes in the way we did it, what happened afterwards in governing Iraq ourselves, rather than what we had agreed before the invasion, that immediately we will turn over Iraq to the Iraqi government by forming an interim government in Iraq. But then President Bush, over time, adjusted his policies, and some of the mistakes that had been made that caused problems were reduced. But then the withdrawal, complete U.S. withdrawal and disengagement from Iraq unraveled the situation and contributed to the rise of ISIS, unfortunately. I believe that going forward, we need to have a strategy and a set of objectives that are in good relationship with each other. For example, we have had an objective that the President of the United States, President Obama, declared of that Bashar must go several years ago in Syria. But the strategy to bring that about was not there. And as a result, there has been a crisis in the strategy between the objective and the policy to pursue that objective. And our level of effort compared to the goals that we have enunciated have been minimal or much smaller. And it has created an opportunity for others to come in. Russia has now become a big player because Russia saw an opportunity with America not playing the strong role. So in the current environment, what can be done, in my view, is one, that we have to go after terrorists who target us and our allies in the region, such as Daesh. That I think everyone agrees on. I don't think there is any disagreement in the United States between the two candidates and between the two parties. But however, going beyond that to address the root causes of this problem, the Shia-Sunni sectarianism, regional policies of rivalry between Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia as to the future shape of this region, the U.S. needs to clarify and decide on an objective of how it relates to these issues. The U.S. has no solution to the sectarian problem. The peoples of the area have to either come together to accept each other and share power, share resources, go for federalism or confederalism. If they do not, then the countries that exist, such as Syria and Iraq, whose borders were imposed by outside powers after the First World War, they will make other choices. They might go for independence, to go separate from each other. So the U.S., I think, has a task ahead, not only to think tactically about and strategically about the terrorism issue, but what kind of a future this region will have and what sort of strategies the U.S. needs to follow, because we live in an age where smaller identities, in the case of Kurds, they have had this identity for a very long time. That's not a new phenomenon, the Kurdish identity. But there was a period where Arab nationalism was very strong. There was a period where Islam as a whole was very strong. But now the smaller identity of are you a Shia or you a Sunni has become more important. And how do they relate to each other, and how do we relate to them, and how do we relate to the geopolitical rivalry between the regional powers?
Many questions pop up in my head as I'm listening to you and your insightful comments about the region and how complex it is. You pointed out that if United States doesn't follow policies or come up with new policies that matches the objectives, then they would have to accept independence. Why do you think United States would be against Kurdish independence if they are?
The United States is not against, in my judgment, Kurdish independence. The Kurds of Iraq, the United States prefers, as I think the Kurds prefer, and I think the world, the region would prefer, that if there is independence, that the independence comes as a result of an agreement between Baghdad and Erbil. Right. That this is a cooperative agreement. What happened in the Czech Republic after the Cold War, where the Slovaks separated from the Czechs, and they became two separate nations, but they based on an agreement. Initially, they tried confederalism. The proposal was for a confederation of the two, but they couldn't agree to it, so they went their separate ways in a peaceful way, and now both are members of the European Union. And so it would be desirable, if independence is the choice that is made, that is done based on an agreement between Kurdistan and Iraq, and that would make it easier for the region, for the United States, for the world.
But that's a huge if, isn't it?
Well, I don't rule it out. If the Kurds want to go independent, my judgment is that the discussions I've heard is between a kind of confederal arrangement, possibly, maybe with a timeline for how many years, or independence. And some would say, let's negotiate, let's see what can be done. But I would think that an arrangement acceptable to both sides would make it easier for the rest of the world. But I'm not predicting, lest you conclude that I think it's easy to get an agreement between Erbil and Baghdad. But I think the way to pursue it is, at first at least, through seeking an agreement between Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq.
Correct. That looks like a peaceful and reasonable agreement. Time for a break. Hold your thoughts. We will be back with you shortly to talk about Plan B if this plan doesn't go through. We're back with Mr. Khalilzad, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and United Nations, and we're talking about Kurdistan independence, Middle East, and the U.S. election. So, Mr. Khalilzad, you pointed out that the best solution, perhaps the most peaceful solution, would be to come to an agreement with Baghdad and come up with a win-win situation. But you know a lot about Iraq. Having your internal insight into how the system works there, do you think Iraq will be capable of staying together and holding and keeping its territorial integrity?
I think it can stay together if, and that's a big if there is genuine power sharing, resource sharing among the big communities that make Iraq, essentially meaning the Kurds and Shia and Sunnis, because Shia and Sunni have become political identities that are important. And the history of the world, because other countries have gone through polarizations as well, is that you either accommodate, accept each other, and come to a reasonable compact. And we try to achieve that through the Constitution. And what was agreed to was a federalism, where the Kurds would run their own region, but there would be power sharing at the center and resource sharing, the 17% of the budget. And the record of the last decade or so show that that arrangement was not followed fairly and effectively, and that has led to the question of what comes next, whether there is a need for a new agreement, for a new compact, and what will that be? And will the Sunni areas, either as a whole or each province that is Sunni majority population, they now, many of them would like to imitate Kurdistan and become regions, either a single region or several regions. They have that right under the Constitution, and there are rules for how they could do it. Unfortunately, previously when they tried, this government in Baghdad didn't allow them to do that. That's a violation of the Constitution. And when you don't accept or observe the existing Constitution, then people say we have to look for something else then. And the Kurds have a lot of complaints about how the Constitution was implemented during the last decade or so, including the budget issue. And so I have heard from talking to Kurdish leaders that there is a desire for a new arrangement, perhaps, since the arrangement as they are have not been effective. So the options are, do you come to a new arrangement where people stay together, but you really implement whatever arrangement it is, and that could take the form of a new federation or a confederal arrangement, or if you don't, and you can't come to an agreement, the Kurds have always said they have the right of self-determination. That's not a new phenomenon. When we were negotiating the Constitution, the Kurds insisted that that's based on the right of Kurdish self-determination. So that's an option. But even if that option is exercised, I repeat myself, it's best if it's done through an agreement with the rest of Iraq.
Right. So theoretically speaking, everything you just brought up is priceless. Power sharing, for example.
Right.
How wonderful is that? Would there be wars in this world if we knew how to share power?
Sure.
You have also criticized Kurdish leaders in the past for their inability to meet their objectives or have specific clear strategies to reach the unity that you're talking about. Now, can we get a little bit more specific and practical and talk about how we can actually get to those agreements and power sharings?
Yeah. Well, you know, nations, countries sometimes go through a crisis, and during these crises, options become available and choices need to be made that in other times are not available or cannot be made. And Iraq and Syria, in my judgment, are in a crisis. They are states of civil war, in effect. How do you end civil wars? One side wins and tries to establish a dictatorial regime, and Iraq has had that experience. The Middle East has had that experience of dictatorships. Remember the Saddam Hussein regime. But in modern days, with communication, with awareness that is there, it seems that people are less willing than they were at times in the past to quietly accept or acquiesce when their rights are denied. And the Kurds have a lot of experience with that, to resist such an arrangement. I think that would be a terrible tragedy if the Middle East went backwards to sort of sectarian or ethnic dictatorship. Sometimes people learn from the experience. We learned, the United States, we went through our own civil war. And then we reached to a federal arrangements, power sharing, a system that you're familiar with. But if, in my judgment, which history of the Middle East would unfortunately tend one to assume that these reasonable arrangements, accepting each other, consensus about the future, power sharing, resource sharing, it doesn't make one very encouraged that that's what is going to be embraced. If that's your assumption, which history could lead you to assume that, then of course the option of war or the option of an agreement to separate. Right. Between those two, separation based on an agreement would be obviously much better, and I believe that would be the best. Now, as far as the Kurdish leaders are concerned, I think given that there is a crisis, given that there are decisions to be made, big decisions potentially to be made that we've been talking about, it's imperative to put little games aside. And all countries have a lot of issues. But the test of a great people is that at times of crisis, they come together because if you can make big decisions based on unity, it's much better. Big decision can be made when there isn't unity, and sometimes they have worked as well. But it'd be better if they come together. And I think unfortunately, what happened to Jalal with his illness has created a vacuum, which has been leading to more disunity and less unity, at least, and cooperation that I would have liked to see as a friend watching from outside.
So what you're saying is friendship and power sharing and coming to agreements isn't just a theory. It has been practiced in history, and Kurds in Iraq could look at United States example.
Or Europe, for example. Europeans fought each other for a very long time, and then now they're part of a European Union. So there are instances in history where it can happen, but the Middle East may not be ready for that.
Right. But exactly, and you talked about how a great nation would be able to unite at times of crisis, but a lot of what nations know how to do is through education. Right. And when you say Middle East is not ready, then maybe has Middle East been educated to know how to share. So as you're aware, Kurdistan is moving towards independence. There will be a referendum held sometimes after the US election. What is your perspective of how that move towards independence is going to take place?
Well, I hope that there will be a discussion between Baghdad and Kurdistan. If there is an agreement between the two sides, there may or may not be a need for a referendum. If there is an agreement, maybe the agreement could be put to a referendum, see whether the Kurds accept it, or if the political leaders and parliament, when it's reconvened, accepts it, there may not be a need for a referendum. That's a decision that President Barzani and others would have to make. But I believe that it would be best for Kurdistan as well as for the rest of Iraq that the future, what happens is discussed between Baghdad and Erbil after the US election and after the Mosul military phase of the operation is over, because everyone is very much focused on that. Lives are at stake. So my recommendation would be the path to be selected is for Kurds to come together under the leadership of President Barzani, and for Kurds then to talk to Baghdad for an agreement to see whether the agreement is feasible or not, and if there can be an agreement, that would be the best. And based on what happens in relations and the discussions between Baghdad and Erbil, a decision can be made on whether to pursue a referendum path as a step towards the decision. And what question will be asked of in the referendum is going to be key. What are the Kurds going to be asked to vote on? And that will determine then the following steps after the referendum.
How do you think the next president of the United States would be able to push towards a peaceful agreement between the two?
Well, the U.S. can play a role, but I think that the most important players in that interaction, besides the United States, first and foremost would be Iraqis and Kurds. And they are the most important, and I'm sure regional players will also play a role, because I'm sure Iran, Turkey, the Arab states, Saudi Arabia would also be watching this. Because what happens in Kurdistan and in Iraq would be important, and it affects the region. So therefore, I think it is not only the local level, Kurds and Iraqis, the regional level, and the United States and the other global powers would have a role. I think it will be the best for everyone to encourage an agreement between Iraq and Kurdistan. And I think the West in particular can play a useful role, particularly the United States, because one thing that's good about the United States, I criticized us before, is that we can think of alternative arrangements that, based on the vast intellectual history of the world, that, set of arrangements that maybe the two sides could be helped to come to an agreement to. But that should happen only if we are needed. Hopefully we won't be needed, and the two sides could come to some arrangement and agreement among themselves. But I believe that the choice is really between a confederal arrangement for some time or independence. I think going back to an old arrangement is going to be very difficult.
And do you see that happening within the next how many years?
This is something that is really up to the President Barzani and the Kurdish leadership and the Iraqis. They have to make up their mind about that.
But as you know, Kurds are moving towards independence, and the agreement you talked about may not be reached anytime soon. What if Kurds do declare independence? How do you think the next United States president would react to that?
I think it will be easier for the United States to accept and cooperate and support if there is an agreement. That will make it easier. But ultimately, the United States recognizes that this is a decision for the Kurds to make. But I do advise the Kurds to pursue their goal through conversations, discussions with Baghdad and other Iraqis. Because Kurdistan could become independent, but it's not going to leave the area. It's going to still be in that neighborhood. So the better relations Kurdistan has with as many neighbors as possible, the better for its independence. Ideally, even if Kurdistan becomes independent, it should have good relations with Turkey, it should have good relations with Iraq, it should have good relations with other neighbors as well. Because it's a landlocked country, and in order to deal with the world, it needs to have good relations with the neighborhood. And therefore, I think Kurdistan has to demonstrate, it would be good for it to demonstrate that it has gone the extra mile of talking to the neighbors, talking to Baghdad to find a mutually acceptable solution, and that it has made that decision after doing all that. So I think there is some work that needs to be done before.
We were here today with Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and the United Nations.